Hello guys, and welcome to my new video, and today we're going to be looking at the Mythic Plus meta and how it has changed when looking at that 0.1% title range. We're going to be looking at tanks, DPS and healers and how or which specs have climbed. Again, big disclaimer, we're looking at the top keys in the world. If your class is not included here, it does not mean it's not capable of doing weekly keys or even above that. We're just looking at the very high level. And we're going to start off looking at real player information. Again, this is for tanks, healers, and there's going to be a DPS one for representation in the top 0.1% of tile range. This has been done by Jordan, a user on X, who just provides a really nice statistical information, which is basically gathered from Radar.io. And we'll talk about Radar.io, but let's look at the charts. So right now you can see here in terms of tanks, Vengeance has definitely overtaken, or it has become that one tank for the highest keys in the world. And I'm not saying you cannot do really high keys as a prot paladin. I think there's a lot of prot paladins who done some of the highest keys, but Vengeance has become the tank. I think there's a lot of pulls that you can set up with Vengeance that you cannot set up with other type of tanks, and I think the tank balance in general has been pretty poor, because for the longest time in Dragonflight in Season 3, it's been between the two tanks, between Vengeance and between Prot Paladin. You just have to look at what these two tanks provide in terms of support, in terms of group CC, in terms of setting up certain pulls. Also, on top of the fact that if you have Vengeance or if you have a Prot Paladin, you can't bring a healer who doesn't provide an interrupt. You can't bring something like a priest or a resto druid. Now, resto druid does have an interrupt, but in order to talent into that interrupt, you have to give up so many points, and sometimes that means you're giving up survivability or giving up certain utility. It's also important to note that there is no real god comp in Season 3. In Season 2, you definitely had a very specific set of DPS, healers, and tanks that you would use to push the highest keys in the world. In Season 3, you don't really have that, and a lot of the times your group composition might depend, like, for example, if you have a Prot Paladin, you might want to get Havoc Demon Hunter in there. Or if you have a Vengeance Demon Hunter, you might not need a Havoc Demon Hunter. A lot of the times people, when building a perfect composition for their 5-man push teams, they're looking to min-max the amount of group buffs that they can get. So that is very big consideration. We'll talk about some of the compositions that I find very interesting, but now let's go and move on to the healers. And now let's go to healers, and there has been 3 healers who are dominating that title range, or in that title range. That is Mistweaver, Monks, Resto Druids, and Priests. In the Priest section, a lot of them are going to be disciplined, but there's quite a few people who are also pushing high keys in the world as Holy Priest, especially after the recent buffs. And honestly, having 3 healers representing majority of the pie in here in that high key level, it's not that bad compared to previous seasons where, for example, in Season 2, you only had a Holy Paladin, and Holy Paladin was absolutely dominating because it had monopoly on spot healing, and Season 2 was really punishing in terms of spot healing. Which one you're going to pick is going to be dependent on which tank you have, on which DPS you have. This is going to be completely dependent on how you're going to spread your buffs. For example, Resto Druid or Druids bring Mark of the Wild. Do you want to have Mark of the Wild in your group, or for example, you might want to have a priest with that fortitude? And Mistweaver Monks, or monks in general, can provide a lot of different utility that a lot of people might not even know. For example, Generous Spore, which provides basically avoidance, which can be insanely powerful when it comes to really high tyrannical keys and survivability. You have things like Mystic Touch, which can be dependent on your group's composition. We'll talk about all of this in terms of surviving high tyrannical keys and the compositions that I enjoy. And besides that, you might look at things like Restoration Shamans. They bring quite a few different things like Ancestral Vigor. We'll talk about that. You'll see Holy Paladin has dropped out a lot because Holy Paladin received a plethora of nerfs, and you might look at this and there is a class that's missing from this, and that is Evoker. Preservation of Evoker is not in this 0.1 title range, and that should ring alarm bells for Blizzard in terms of trying to balance Evoker a little bit better, or Preservation of Evoker, because it's one of those healers that dropped off significantly from Season 1, but it's going to be the range limitations, the fact that Augmentation is kind of stealing their spot. Something needs to be done about Preservation of Evoker, and hopefully that's going to change in Season 4. And now let's talk about DPS, and primarily range DPS and then melee DPS. And you can see here in range, mages have climbed a lot. They did receive a buff. A lot of this is going to be, again, fire represents a big chunk of this. Fire has been very popular, and you look at evokers, and this is going to be primarily augmentation evokers. Augmentation evoker used to have a much bigger slice in the pie, and we'll talk about the need or the drop-off augmentation. Even when it comes to really high keys, there's been quite a few compositions who don't actually have augmentation evoker in their keys, and we'll talk about the reasons why. You'll see Warlock here. Shadow Priests have climbed a lot, considering that Shadow was really not doing too well at the start of Season 3. And then with the recent buffs, Shadow Priests are absolutely meta, and some of the highest keys in the world have been completed with Shadow Priests. You'll see Balanced Druids, and then you'll see hunters. I think it's worth noting that I've definitely seen a trend for poke groups, especially who are trying to poke point 1 title, doing high tyrannical keys. They tend to, or I've seen people avoiding something like balanced druids, to lesser extent hunters, because they require a little bit more babysitting from your healer. Those groups might opt into tankier DPS like mages or warlocks who have plethora of defensives, especially considering that a lot of the key meta is about survivability. But of course, this is very dependent on the player themselves, on how they use their defensives, on how they use their survivability, but this is something that I've seen in Pugs, especially in high tyrannical keys. On the flip side, when we look at melee, again, Havoc Demon Hunter still representing a big slice, even though they received quite a few nerfs in Season 3 because they were doing so well. Rogue is pretty good in terms of melee, and Retribution Paladin has climbed a lot because, again, Red received buffs, Mages received buffs, Shadow Priest received buffs. There's a lot of classes that received significant changes, and that really has changed some of the meta. And Retribution, especially if you have that legendary, can really pump. Your damage is really high, your utility is good, your survivability is good. So this is actually the website where all this information is coming from. And again, these charts are just represented in a really nice way, but you can see some of the highest keys in terms of 32, so you can see the compositions here. Again, if we look at a 25 and up key level, if you look at, for example, tanks, you can see Vengeance. We talked about it. Vengeance is becoming more unpopular in terms of healers. You can see the split between healers is okay. Majority of them are Discipline Priest. You can see Mistweavers, Restoration Druid, and then everyone else is really falling behind. In terms of DPS, you'll notice here, Havoc Demon Hunters, Augmentation. Again, in terms of Warlocks, you can see here a lot of Demonology, but when you go to 30 and up, which is absolutely the highest keys in the world, you can see the split between Destruction and Demonology is relatively even. So that's something to consider, because a lot of this information or data is taken throughout the whole season. You can see Outlaw is going to be the most popular rogue specs. Again, Fire Mage is one of the most popular mages spec. You can see here a Beastmaster Hunter and Retribution Paladin climbing quite a bit. In terms of the composition, you can see some of the highest keys, and you can see, for example, if you have a Vengeance Demon Hunter, you don't really want to have Havoc, because you don't want to really overlap the utility and basically the raid buffs or group buffs that they provide. So a lot of the times, I like a lot of these comps here. For example, Vengeance Demon Hunter, Mistweaver Monk, and then you have a Shadow Priest who gives you Fortitude. You have a Balanced Druid who gives you Mark of the Wild, and then you have a Mage who gives you that Bloodlust on top of Intellect and things like that. So this has become a really popular comp for a lot of these high key pushes. And then you have another comp with Proud Paladin, and you can see here this is a Proud Paladin with Restoration Druid, and Resto Druid does not need to have an interrupt, because Proud Paladin will handle a lot of their interrupts for the group. You can almost consider them as like an interrupt bot to some extent. You have Restoration Druid, you have again Fire Mage, you have a Havoc Demon Hunter, and you have Shadow Priest. You're spreading all of those group buffs in a really nice way that provides damage, that provides utility, that provides survivability. You can also look at teams like Andy's team, who actually is running Discipline Priest, and again, they are running an Augmentation Evoker, and this is where we're going to talk about augmentation. We're going to talk about the need of augmentation. So for a long time, especially in Season 2, you have to have an Augmentation Evoker. In Season 3, people are still, we're kind of leaning towards you need to have Augmentation Evoker for the highest keys in order to survive a lot of mechanics. A lot of people seem to think right now is that if you bring an Augmentation Evoker, that's going to kind of lower the overall DPS of the group rather than having 3 pure DPS classes. But if you're doing a key where survivability is going to really matter, augmentation is going to be really good. The problem with augmentation right now in lower keys than these, lower than the highest keys in the world, is that a lot of augmentation evokers out there are really not that great, and they're kind of hiding behind the guise of the class. So if you're trying to poke keys, if you're trying to poke that 0.1 title range, augmentation evoker can be very hit and miss. But if you have a good augmentation evoker, you're going to have a really good time. At the end of the day, I like to think that if you're playing a Discipline Priest, a lot of the classes or a lot of comps out there that have Discipline Priest, they're going to be bringing something like Augmentation Evoker, because I tend to think that Discipline Priest tends to want Augmentation Evoker more than the rest of the meta healers. For example, if you're running Restoration Druid or Mistweaver Monk, they can provide a lot of pure HPS, and they can meet a lot of those healing checks relatively easily. If you're running Discipline Priest, you could still want that Augmentation Evoker to help you out in order to meet those healing checks. But of course, this is not set in stone. You can have many different compositions with Discipline Priest, and one of the reasons why Disc is more popular in high-end key pushing over something like a Holy Priest is because it brings so much survivability to your group. Discipline Priest, you have access to something like double pain suppression, you have powerful shielding, you have barrier, and of course you have 3% damage reduction with lenience, which can be really powerful when approaching high tyrannical keys. So just an example in terms of if you're doing really high tyrannical keys, again, we're looking at 28 key level. This is my Restoration Druid. Again, this is a website, not even close to. Again, a lot of people are using, my group is using this to see if they're going to need an external in order to survive certain boss mechanics. In this case, it's going to be a tile design. You can see here Soul Rend, which is basically going to spawn ads, and I am going to die here. You can click on this. This is going to be an overkill of 51,000 based on my stamina, based on my versatility, and I'm not going into bear form. If I'm going into bear form, I'm going to survive. And a lot of the survivability for Druid specifically is going to come down to, are you able to go into bear form? Because that's the only way to survive really high tyrannical keys. But for example, if you don't have a bear form, if you're not a Resto Druid, if you're not, again, specifically this class, you can look at the value of certain buffs that the classes can bring. For example, here, Ancestral Vigor, which is what the Resto Shamans can bring, which is 10% HP, and this is going to be applied from a lot of their heals. This is pretty insane in terms of, hey, I would actually die from this ability, but if I had a Resto Shaman who has Ancestral Vigor, I would survive. Or if you're looking at certain abilities, again, Generous Pour is not relevant here because it does provide 4% AoE DOR, but these abilities are not counted as AoE, so that's not going to help at all here. But for example, having things like Mark of the Wild and Power Word Fortitude, I'm still going to die, but the overkill is going to be significantly lower. So spreading your party buffs, things like Mark of the Wild, things like Fortitude, and you can see this is very evident in some of the highest keys or groups in the world in terms of trying to min-max their buffs or group buffs. For example, if you provide Mark of the Wild, it's going to give you 3% versatility, which gives you additional survivability, but also gives you additional damage. Again, Fortitude is going to provide additional survivability. Whether you're getting Fortitude from a Shadow Priest or a Heal Priest doesn't really matter. Whether you're getting Mark of the Wild from something like a Resto Druid or a Balanced Druid doesn't really matter. So it's really dependent on which healer you're going to be bringing, because there's a lot of healers that can fill those spots. In terms of which tanks, again, not a lot of spots open here in terms of Vengeance and a Proud Paladin, but again, your group is also going to depend on which DPS you're bringing, and do you want to bring an augmentation. If you're bringing an augmentation, or for example, if you're bringing a Discipline Priest, you might want to consider augmentation. You can see where I'm going. A lot of these compositions out there, they're not trying to, how do I say, overlap utilities. They're not stacking certain classes. They're trying to get as many different raid or, how do I say, group buffs out there as possible, because a lot of the specs in terms of DPS and healers are viable. So guys, let me know how you feel about this video. Again, this is a quick glimpse into the meta when it comes to the highest keys in the world. Again, I said there is no god comp out there, but there's definitely quite a bit of variety when it comes to spreading your group buffs, providing as much damage, providing as much survivability. I really want to know your opinion on multiple different things. How do you feel about augmentation evokers? They're still used in the highest keys in the world. Again, depending on what the group composition is. Do you think augmentation evokers are as mandatory as they used to be in Season 2? Which is honestly, you can see from the graph, they're not really. But how do you feel about augmentation evokers? How do you feel about the rise of Shadow Priest? How do you feel about the healer balance right now? 3 specs being used in the highest keys in the world is really interesting. How do you feel about Preservation Evoker, or the fall of Preservation Evoker from Season 1 to Season 3? And honestly, the tank balance, how do you think that could be improved? Because right now it's not looking all that hot. Let me know how you feel about the meta. Let me know which class you're playing, and let me know how Blizzard could improve this class balance in the future. What are your hopes for Season 4? If you like this video, like and subscribe, and I'll see you in my next guide.